Today's video is going to be on George Martin, and I'm going to focus on the music he was working on while he was producing the Beatles, but stuff that he was doing under the name the George Martin Orchestra. And we all know the story. He had been around at EMI and worked his way up and had done all kinds of interesting records. He wasn't just a comedy producer as is reported. He did all kinds of music, every genre practically that there was at the time. And by the time the Beatles signed, things started to really happen for him. Obviously, he had a lot more visibility, and he was the most famous record producer in the world because he was producing the most famous band in the world. And one of the first things he did of note, once the Beatles were under contract and started recording, is he signed another individual by the name of Matt Monro. One of the first things he did was to record the vocal for From Russia with Love. George Martin didn't really have anything to do with the production of that song, but he did sign Matt Monro. So that was a pretty beefy role to have. And he actually had a little bit to do with the next Bond movie, which was 1964. Although George Martin's name does not appear on this soundtrack, he actually recorded and produced the session for Shirley Bassey's vocal on the title track. And apparently they were having all kinds of problems with it, and Bassey could not deliver that over-the-top vocal that they were looking for. And apparently George Martin kind of took her aside and they had a little discussion over the baffles. Shirley Bassey's bra comes off, they do the take, she nails it. So apparently that freed her up a little bit. So 1964, obviously, Beatlemania, and I did a video recently on this album, the American version, which has 4 instrumental tracks by the George Martin Orchestra. And I wanted to do a video on this album because it just doesn't get talked about. All the American albums are typically viewed as not nearly as valuable. They weren't initially what the Beatles had intended, but millions of us heard this. So I thought, well, let's dive into some of George Martin's work, and that's what kind of led me to do this video. Now, the song of note on here is Ringo's theme, which was an instrumental version of the song This Boy, which is an integral part of the movie and probably one of the best scenes of the movie. Obviously, George Martin became somewhat of a household name almost when the Beatles became popular. So much so that when that album was done and the film was out, George Martin did his own album called Instrumental Versions of the Beatles' Big Hits. It's called Off the Beatles Track, by their brilliant recording director, George Martin and his orchestra. This has several songs from Hard Day's Night, but also songs from the first couple of albums, including There's a Place and All I've Got to Do. Now, the song This Boy, or Ringo's theme, charted at number 53 in the United States when it was released as a single. And it was released in the UK as well, but it didn't chart. But obviously there was demand for Beatle products. So what happened next? George Martin did this. Backed by popular demand, A Hard Day's Night. This is a very cool cover. I always liked this. So this album's got several songs from the film. The version of Ringo's theme, This Boy, is the exact same version that's on this one here. If I can pull it out here. The same version. So he's not re-recording the same songs. And all these albums so far were on United Artists. So these are not EMI recordings. So the next one, we have Jerry and the Pacemakers, Ferry Across the Mersey. Now, George Martin he was producing Jerry and the Pacemakers, Cilla Black, Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas. So this is a son of A Hard Day's Night, more Liverpool focused. And you see the music director, George Martin, is very big on the front. And the key track on here is the big hit, Ferry Across the Mersey.
So ferry cross the Mersey, cross this land.
So this album was early 1965. So mid-65 or so, George Martin scores instrumental versions of the hits. We have some hits that aren't Beatles songs. This is his first non-Beatle album. And a couple of the highlights on here are All Quiet on the Mersey Front and the Petula Clark song, Downtown. We're in summer of '65 now, and the Beatles are doing the album or the film Help. And you might be saying, well, Matt, George Martin did not do the score for this. That is true. One of the reasons he didn't do the score for this is that Dick Lester and George Martin did not get along. And the fact that A Hard Day's Night got George Martin so much fame and credit, and he won, I think he was nominated for a Grammy as well. That didn't set well with Lester. Lester brought his own guy in, Ken Thorne, for this album. And Martin was pissed. The Beatles really couldn't do much about it. So anyway, with George Martin not being able to do this score, what he did, he said, well, okay, I'm going to do my own album. George Martin and his orchestra play Help and other instrumental versions of the Beatles songs by the brilliant recording director. This album is kind of interesting because it's got all the main 7 songs from Help that are inside one of the British version. But the other songs that are listed on here go by alternate titles. For example, Auntie Gin's theme, that's I've Just Seen a Face. That's a Nice Hat Cap, that is It's Only Love. And Scrambled Egg is Yesterday. So one of the more interesting stories of any of these albums happens to be from this album. And this story blew my mind. So the Beatles, or EMI, cheap bastards that they were, they would record over all the old tapes. They would recycle them. And on the song Ticket to Ride, on this record, the George Martin Orchestra, that tape happened to get recycled, and some 6, 7, 8 years later, some sound effects were recorded on that tape. Now, when you record over something, it doesn't completely erase away everything underneath. And these sound effects were heartbeats. And these were the heartbeats that were used on Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. And you can actually hear some of Ticket to Ride, as played by the George Martin Orchestra, on that album. Let me read for you here. Faint remnants of the George Martin recording can be detected on vinyl copies of the Pink Floyd album as Side 2 concludes, while later remastered compact disc releases contain a corrected mix that omits the Ticket to Ride orchestration entirely. So who'd have thunk it? All right, so the next album is a British album called And I Love Her. There was a series called Studio 2 Stereo, which has this kind of fading square motif in the back. And this is a very similar album to the American release called George Martin Scores Instrumental Versions of the Hits. The next album, we are in 1966, late 66, and this is George Martin instrumentally salutes the Beatle Girls. So a cool picture on the front here, surrounded by some women here. His wife probably didn't go for that too much, but that was the times. You've got a couple Beatle albums here. Revolver with like a white border on it, which I've never seen before. Beatles for Sale, Rubber Soul. A lot of girl songs that you would expect to be on here, like Michelle, Anna, Girl, Good Day Sunshine is on here, And Your Bird Can Sing, Eleanor Rigby. But also some songs that you wouldn't expect to be on here. All right, the next album is another soundtrack, The Family Way. And this is, I guess, famous for having some Paul McCartney affiliation with it, though he did very little on this. The idea is that McCartney was going to come up with music and George Martin was going to interpret it for him, score it, and that would become the soundtrack. The only problem was Paul McCartney wasn't offering any music to George Martin at all. And he kept after him, and finally he had to just go to his house and McCartney composed a little something for him while he waited. Let's see what they say about it here. McCartney's contribution was minimal. McCartney composed a brief piano piece which Martin then interpreted into several variations and arrangements, sufficient to produce 24 minutes of music. That's from Steve Turner's 2016 book, Beatles 66, The Revolutionary Year. So Love in the Open Air did win the Ivor Novello Award for Best Instrumental in 1968. So it's kind of a nice piece, but nothing too standoutish. In late 1967, George Martin was commissioned to write the theme for BBC Radio 1's launch in September and came up with a great piece of music with the very unoriginal title, Theme 1. I think that's one of his best pieces of music. I just love that song. And that was on the forthcoming album, London by George. Again, George Martin and his orchestra. This is also United Artists. And this has some more interesting songs, I guess, songs you might not expect George Martin to do. Winchester Cathedral, Whiter Shade of Pale, To Sir with Love, Alfie, and a couple of originals, one being Elephants and Castles. So here's the back of the album here, and kind of cool chick on the front with the sitar, holding it completely improperly. He has a couple interesting songs on here, for instance, Sgt. Pepper and the unlikely cover of Hole in My Shoe. Now, the British version of this album had a similar cover, but it was called British Made. So that was also 1968. Later in 68, George Martin was working on this for the Beatles, Yellow Submarine soundtrack. And I think he did a wonderful job on this. Occasionally I do listen to side 2. All of his tracks are on one side, which is kind of convenient. And they're rather similar in style to some of the work he did on Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour. And if the music that he concocted for this and that he wrote really fit the animation well. So by 1970, this album got re-released with a different cover, and it was called By George. So that closed out that type of work that he was doing. Most of it obviously is Beatle related, which is fine. And there's times when I'm really in the mood for some of that period piece soundtrack work. And let's face it, some of this stuff is a little bit corny, a little cheesy, but sometimes I like a little bit of cheese. And George Martin serves it up very well on these albums. So if you get a chance to pick any of these albums up, they're getting a little harder to find, but they're worth it, and they're just fun to listen to. So that's my George Martin orchestra video. I've got plenty of other stuff coming up, more Beatles stuff coming. Check out my website. I've got merchandise and my Patreon subscription below. Thank you for watching Pop Goes the 60s.